The year was 1882, and the small town of Redemption Creek sat like a jewel in the harsh desert of Arizona Territory. Unlike many frontier towns that sprang up overnight around gold strikes or railroad stops, Redemption Creek had been carefully planned by its founder, a former Union Army colonel named William Hayes. The town boasted wide streets lined with wooden sidewalks, a proper schoolhouse, a whitewashed church with a tall steeple, and even a small library, luxuries that most frontier settlements could only dream of. Sheriff Jacob "Jake" Morrison stood on the wooden porch of his office, his weathered hands resting on the brass star pinned to his leather vest. At 35, Jake had already seen more than his share of trouble. His sun-beaten face bore the map of a hard life, a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, courtesy of a Comanche warrior's knife, crow's feet from squinting into countless sunrises while tracking outlaws, and eyes the color of steel that had witnessed both the worst and best of humanity. The morning sun painted the desert mountains in shades of purple and gold, but Jake wasn't admiring the scenery. His attention was fixed on the wanted poster he held in his calloused hands. The face staring back at him belonged to Marcus "Black Jack" Sullivan, one of the most notorious outlaws in the Arizona Territory. The poster went on to list Black Jack's crimes: 17 bank robberies across 3 territories, 6 stagecoach holdups, and the deaths of 2 lawmen. What made Sullivan particularly dangerous wasn't just his quick draw, though he was rumored to be faster than Wild Bill Hickok himself, but his intelligence. Unlike most outlaws who relied on brute force and intimidation, Black Jack planned his jobs with military precision and always seemed to stay one step ahead of the law. "Another sleepless night, brother?" Jake turned to see his younger sister, Emma, approaching with a steaming cup of coffee. At 23, Emma Morrison possessed the kind of beauty that could stop conversation in a crowded saloon. Her auburn hair caught the morning light like spun copper, and her green eyes held the same determined spark that ran in the Morrison family. But Emma was more than just a pretty face. She had been the schoolmarm of Redemption Creek for 3 years, teaching children to read and write while also serving as the town's unofficial nurse when Doc Patterson was away on his rounds. "Thanks, Em," Jake said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Just thinking about our friend here." He showed her the wanted poster. Emma studied the sketch with interest. The artist had captured a lean face with sharp cheekbones, dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. There was something almost romantic about the outlaw's appearance, like a character from one of the dime novels that secretly found their way into her room despite Jake's disapproval. "He's younger than I expected," Emma observed. "How old do you think he is?" 28, according to the Pinkerton report, Jake replied, taking a sip of the strong coffee. "Started his criminal career at 16 when he robbed a general store in Kansas. Been escalating ever since." What Jake didn't tell his sister was that Black Jack Sullivan was reported to be heading toward Arizona Territory, possibly toward their very region. A Wells Fargo stagecoach had been robbed just 50 miles north of Redemption Creek 3 days ago, and witnesses described a lone gunman with Sullivan's distinctive style, polite, almost gentlemanly, but absolutely ruthless when crossed. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted Jake's thoughts. A rider was coming hard from the north, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. Jake recognized Tom Bradley, one of the cowboys from the Circle R Ranch, and knew from the man's urgent pace that trouble was following close behind. "Sheriff Morrison," Tom called out as he reined in his horse in front of the jail. "You need to get word to the bank and the general store. Black Jack Sullivan hit the stagecoach to Tucson this morning, not 20 miles from here." Jake felt his blood turn cold. "Anyone hurt?" "Driver took a bullet in the shoulder, but he'll live. Sullivan made off with the strongbox, probably $2,000 inside." "But Sheriff, there's something else." Tom dismounted, his face grim. One of the passengers said Sullivan asked specific questions about Redemption Creek. Wanted to know about the town, the people, how many lawmen we have. Emma felt a chill run down her spine despite the warming desert air. "Why would an outlaw be interested in our little town?" she asked. Jake's jaw tightened. He had a pretty good idea why. Redemption Creek was prosperous enough to be worth robbing but small enough that one man might think he could handle whatever law enforcement stood in his way. And with the railroad survey team having been through town last month, word had probably spread that the bank was holding extra money in anticipation of land purchases. "Tom, I want you to ride over to the telegraph office and send messages to Tucson and Phoenix. Let them know Sullivan's in the area and moving south. Then stop by Doc Patterson's and have him take a look at that shoulder of yours. You're bleeding through your shirt." It was true. In his haste to bring the warning, Tom hadn't noticed the red stain spreading across his left shoulder where a bullet had grazed him. As Tom hurried toward the telegraph office, Jake turned to Emma. I want you to stay close to town today. And tell your students that school is dismissed early. I don't want any children wandering around alone until we know where Sullivan has gone. Emma nodded, but Jake could see the excitement in her eyes. As much as she loved teaching and helping others, part of her yearned for adventure. She had grown up on stories of the frontier, tales of brave lawmen and dangerous outlaws, of fortunes won and lost in games of chance. The arrival of a notorious bandit in their peaceful town was the most exciting thing to happen in Redemption Creek since the Great Flood of 1880. I'll be careful, she promised, but Jake knew his sister well enough to worry. Later that afternoon, as the sun reached its peak and the desert heat shimmered off the dusty streets, a lone rider approached Redemption Creek from the east. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man born to the saddle, and even from a distance, there was something about him that commanded attention. Marcus Sullivan, though the people of Redemption Creek didn't yet know his identity, was indeed a striking figure. The wanted posters had captured his appearance reasonably well, but they couldn't convey the magnetism that seemed to surround him like an invisible cloak. He wore a black hat tilted at just the right angle, a white shirt that was surprisingly clean for a man who had been riding hard, and a black leather vest that bore no ornamentation except for the pearl-handled Colt .45 that rode low on his right hip. But it was his eyes that set him apart, dark blue like storm clouds, holding intelligence, humor, and just a hint of danger. These were the eyes of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty but hadn't let it completely harden his heart. As he rode down Main Street, Marcus took careful note of everything. The layout of the buildings, the positioning of the sheriff's office relative to the bank, the number of horses tied to hitching posts, and most importantly, the people themselves. He had learned long ago that understanding a town's character was just as important as knowing its geography. Redemption Creek impressed him. Unlike the rough mining camps and railroad towns he usually encountered, this place had the feeling of a real community. Children played in the dust while their mothers watched from nearby porches. Shopkeepers swept their storefronts and called friendly greetings to passers-by. An old man sat whittling in the shade of the general store, his arthritic hands shaping a piece of pine into what looked like a toy horse. Marcus felt an unexpected pang of something. Longing, perhaps? He had been running from the law for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be part of a community, to have a place where people knew your name and cared about your welfare. He shook off the feeling and focused on the task at hand. He needed supplies, information, and a place to rest his horse. The Silver Dollar Saloon seemed like the logical choice for all three. The saloon was typical of frontier establishments: rough-hewn wooden tables, a long bar topped with scratched mahogany, and the smell of tobacco, whiskey, and sawdust. But it was cleaner than most, and the bartender looked him over with the practiced eye of a man who had served everyone from traveling preachers to gun-slinging desperados. "What'll it be, stranger?" asked the bartender, a heavy-set man with graying hair and intelligent eyes. "Whiskey and information if you're willing to share it," Marcus replied, placing a silver dollar on the bar, a generous tip that didn't go unnoticed. "Name's Pete Hawkins. I own this place." The bartender poured a generous measure of whiskey into a clean glass. "What kind of information you looking for?" Marcus had learned that the best lies contained a kernel of truth. "I'm a horse trader looking to buy some good stock. Heard there might be ranchers in this area willing to sell." It was partially true. Marcus did know horses and he often posed as a trader when scouting new territory. But his real interest lay in understanding the town's defenses and the character of its sheriff. "Horse trader, eh?" Pete studied him with renewed interest. "You've come to the right place. The Circle R Ranch has some of the finest quarter horses in the territory, and old Miguel Santos raises Spanish horses that are tougher than leather. Course, you'll want to talk to Sheriff Morrison before you do any serious business. He likes to know who's coming and going in his town." "Smart man," Marcus observed, sipping his whiskey. It was surprisingly good, smooth and aged, not the rotgut he expected in a frontier saloon. "This Sheriff Morrison sounds like someone to respect." "Jake's a good man," Pete agreed. "Fought in the war, Second Battle of Bull Run, Gettysburg, Sherman's March to the Sea. Came out here afterwards looking for a fresh start. Been sheriff for 5 years now and we've had less trouble than most towns. He's got a way of talking sense into folks before things get out of hand." Marcus filed away this information. A veteran sheriff with combat experience would be more dangerous than the usual frontier lawman. "Family man?" "Got a sister, Emma. Prettiest girl in 3 counties and smart as a whip. Teaches at the school." Pete leaned in conspiratorially. "Between you and me, half the young men in town are sweet on her, but Jake's protective. Hasn't met a suitor yet that he thought was good enough for his little sister. Before Marcus could respond, the saloon doors swung open and Jake Morrison himself walked in. Even without an introduction, Marcus would have known him for the sheriff. He carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to authority, and his eyes swept the room with professional thoroughness before settling on the stranger at the bar. "Afternoon, Pete," Jake said, approaching the bar. His gaze never left Marcus. "Don't believe I've seen you around here before." Marcus turned to face the sheriff, his movements smooth and unhurried. "Marcus Thompson," he said, extending his hand. The alias came naturally, he had used variations of it in half a dozen towns. "Horse trader from Colorado. Just riding through looking for stock to buy." Jake shook the offered hand, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work but also the quickness and strength that suggested other skills. "Jake Morrison, sheriff of this town. Pete tell you about our local ranchers?" He did indeed. "Sounds like you've got some fine horse country around here." "We do." "You planning on staying long?" It was asked casually, but Marcus sensed the steel beneath the sheriff's polite tone. "Just a few days depending on what I find. I'm camped about a mile north of town. Didn't want to impose on your hospitality without an invitation." This was a smart move and Jake recognized it as such. A man with something to hide would try to blend in, get a room at the hotel and avoid drawing attention. Someone camping outside town was either very confident or very careful. "Well, Mr. Thompson, Redemption Creek welcomes honest business. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." The two men nodded to each other with mutual respect, though each was measuring the other for different reasons. After Jake left to continue his rounds, Marcus finished his whiskey and headed for the general store to buy supplies. It was there, as he was selecting jerky and hardtack for his supposed camp, that he first saw Emma Morrison. She had come into the store to buy slate pencils for her students, her arms full of books and papers that had spilled from her satchel when she tried to manage too much at once. Marcus watched as she knelt to gather the scattered materials, and without thinking, he moved to help her. "Allow me, miss," he said, collecting several papers and a small leather-bound book. Emma looked up and their eyes met for the first time. Later, both would swear that something electric passed between them in that moment, a recognition that went deeper than sight, as if two souls had found each other across the vast emptiness of the frontier. "Thank you," Emma said softly, accepting the papers from his hands. Their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert sun. "My pleasure," Marcus replied. "I'm Marcus Thompson. And you must be the famous Miss Morrison that Pete mentioned." Emma blushed prettily. "Famous? I hardly think so. I just teach school. From what I hear, you do much more than that. They tell me you're the town's angel of mercy when folks are sick or hurt." "People help where they can," Emma said, but she was pleased by the compliment. There was something about this stranger that set him apart from the usual travelers who passed through Redemption Creek. He had an educated way of speaking and a natural gallantry that reminded her of the heroes in her favorite novels. Marcus found himself reluctant to end the conversation. "I don't suppose you could recommend a good place to water my horse? I'm camped north of town, but I'm not familiar with the local springs." "There's a creek about half a mile past the schoolhouse," Emma said. "Follow the road north until you see the big cottonwood tree, then head east. The water's clean and cold even in summer." "Thank you kindly, Miss Morrison. Perhaps I'll have the pleasure of seeing you again before I leave town." "Perhaps," Emma replied, but as Marcus tipped his hat and headed for the door, she found herself hoping it would be sooner rather than later. Neither of them noticed Jake Morrison watching through the window of his office across the street, his expression thoughtful and troubled. That evening, as the desert sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Emma found herself walking toward the schoolhouse to retrieve a book she had forgotten. It was a pleasant evening for a stroll, and the route took her past the big cottonwood tree where she had directed the stranger to find water for his horse. She told herself she wasn't hoping to encounter Marcus Thompson again, but when she saw the flicker of a campfire through the trees, her heart quickened. Before she could think better of it, she found herself leaving the road and walking toward the light. Marcus was sitting beside a small fire, his horse grazing peacefully nearby. He had removed his hat and vest, and the firelight played across his features, softening the hard edges that made him look dangerous in daylight. He was reading a book, something that surprised Emma, as most drifters she had encountered were barely literate. "Good evening, Mr. Thompson," she called out, not wanting to startle him. Marcus looked up and smiled, closing the book and rising to his feet in one fluid motion. "Miss Morrison. What a pleasant surprise. Are you out for an evening constitutional?" "I was walking to the schoolhouse," Emma replied, then found herself adding, I saw your fire and wanted to make sure you had found the water source I mentioned. Indeed I did, and your directions were perfect. Would you care to sit by the fire for a moment? I was just making coffee. Emma knew she should decline and continue on her way. A proper young lady didn't visit men in their camps, especially men she had just met. But there was something about Marcus Thompson that made her want to break the rules she had lived by all her life. I suppose I could stay for a few minutes, she said, settling gracefully on a fallen log that Marcus had positioned near the fire. As he prepared coffee in a battered tin pot, Emma noticed the book he had been reading. Sir Walter Scott? She asked, surprised. The Lady of the Lake? Marcus glanced at the volume and smiled. Guilty pleasure, I'm afraid. Most folks expect a horse trader to read the Bible or farming almanacs, but I've always had a weakness for poetry and adventure stories. Emma felt her heart flutter. A man who read poetry was a rarity on the frontier, where survival skills were valued far more highly than education. It's one of my favorites, she admitted, though I must say I prefer Lord Byron. Ah, a woman of passion and romance, Marcus said with a teasing smile. Byron suits you better than Scott, I think. You have the spirit for his work. They talked as the coffee brewed, discovering a shared love of literature that went far beyond what either had expected to find in this remote corner of Arizona. Marcus quoted Shelley and Keats with the same ease that he might discuss horses or weather, while Emma revealed a depth of learning that impressed him more than mere beauty ever could. How does a schoolmarm in a frontier town come to know so much poetry? Marcus asked as he handed her a cup of coffee. Books find their way even to places like Redemption Creek, Emma replied. And I had a wonderful teacher at the academy in St. Louis before I came west. She believed that a mind without poetry was like a garden without flowers. St. Louis? That's a long way from here. What brought you to Arizona? Emma's expression grew wistful. Jake came here after the war looking for a new start. Our parents died of cholera when I was 16, and Jake was all the family I had left. When he sent for me 3 years ago, I came gladly. I love it here, even though it's nothing like the life I once imagined for myself. And what life had you imagined? Oh, the usual foolish dreams of a young woman. I thought I might become a famous writer, or marry a dashing gentleman and travel to Europe to see the great art galleries. She laughed softly. Instead, I teach children their letters and help Doc Patterson set broken bones. Those don't sound like foolish dreams to me, Marcus said quietly. And there's still time. You're young yet. Not so young that I don't recognize impossible dreams when I see them, Emma replied. But I'm content. I have work that matters, a brother who loves me, and a community that needs me. It's a good life. Marcus stared into the fire, moved by her quiet dignity. Here was a woman who had adapted to circumstances without losing her essential self, who had found purpose and meaning in a life that was probably far removed from her original hopes. It was a kind of courage that he both admired and envied. What about you? Emma asked. Have you always been a horse trader? For a moment, Marcus was tempted to tell her the truth, to share the real story of Marcus Sullivan, the boy who had grown up poor and hungry, who had turned to crime not out of greed but out of desperation, who had continued down that dark path until it was the only one he knew how to walk. But the moment passed and he stuck to his cover story. I've done various things, he said carefully. Cowboy work, some scouting for the army, freight hauling. Horse trading seemed like a natural progression. It was partially true. Marcus had indeed worked as a cowboy in his youth, before circumstances had driven him to robbery. But Emma sensed there was more to the story, depths that he wasn't ready to reveal. They talked until the fire burned low and the stars grew bright overhead. When Emma finally rose to leave, she felt as if she were awakening from a pleasant dream. Thank you for the coffee and the conversation, she said. I can't remember when I've enjoyed an evening more. Nor can I, Marcus replied, and he meant it. I hope this won't be the last time we have the opportunity to talk. I hope so too, Emma said softly. As she walked back toward town, Emma's mind was spinning with new thoughts and feelings. Marcus Thompson was unlike any man she had ever met, educated and cultured, yet with an air of mystery that made her want to know more about him. There had been moments during their conversation when she had glimpsed something almost vulnerable in his eyes, as if he were a man carrying secrets that weighed heavily upon his soul. Meanwhile, Marcus watched her retreating figure until it disappeared into the darkness, then sat back down by the dying fire to think. He had come to Redemption Creek with a simple plan: scout the town, identify the best targets, plan his approach, and execute a quick robbery before moving on. It was a strategy that had served him well in the past. But Emma Morrison had changed everything. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus found himself wondering what it would be like to stop running, to put down roots, to become the kind of man who could court a woman like Emma openly and honestly. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. He was still wrestling with these unfamiliar emotions when he heard the soft sound of approaching hoofbeats. His hand moved instinctively to his gun as a rider emerged from the darkness. It was Jake Morrison, and even in the dim firelight, Marcus could see that the sheriff's expression was troubled. "Evening, Mr. Thompson," Jake said, dismounting and approaching the fire. "Mind if I join you for a minute?" "Not at all, Sheriff. Coffee's still warm if you'd like some." Jake accepted the offered cup and sat down across the fire from Marcus. For several moments, neither man spoke. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "My sister's a good woman, Mr. Thompson. Kind, intelligent, generous to a fault. She's also more trusting than is wise in a place like this." Marcus felt his muscles tense, but he kept his voice steady. "She seems like a remarkable young lady." "That she is. And she's been hurt before by men who took advantage of her generous nature. Traveling salesman about 2 years ago told her all sorts of pretty lies about taking her back east with him. When he disappeared one night with the church's collection money, it nearly broke her heart." The warning was subtle but unmistakable. Jake Morrison was serving notice that he would not tolerate anyone who might harm his sister. "I understand your concern, Sheriff," Marcus said carefully, "and I respect it. Your sister is fortunate to have someone who cares about her welfare." "She is indeed. And I hope any man who shows interest in her would have similar care for her happiness and reputation." The two men looked at each other across the fire, each taking the other's measure. Jake saw a man who was dangerous but not evil, someone who carried himself with the confidence of a professional gunman but showed no signs of the casual cruelty that marked most outlaws. Marcus saw a lawman who was tough but fair, someone who would be a formidable enemy but an even better friend. "I appreciate you speaking plainly, Sheriff," Marcus said finally. "A woman like your sister deserves nothing less than complete honesty from any man in her life." "I'm glad we understand each other," Jake replied, finishing his coffee and standing up. "Well, I'll let you get back to your evening. See you around town, Mr. Thompson." As Jake rode back toward town, Marcus stared into the fire and contemplated the cruel irony of his situation. He had finally met a woman who could make him want to change his life, but he was probably the last man on earth who could offer her the honesty and stability she deserved. For the first time since he had become Black Jack Sullivan, Marcus began to question whether the price of his chosen life might be higher than he had ever imagined. The next morning brought news that sent ripples of excitement and fear through Redemption Creek. A telegram had arrived from Tucson reporting that Black Jack Sullivan had robbed another stagecoach, this time only 30 miles south of town. The bandit seemed to be circling the area like a wolf stalking prey, and everyone wondered when and where he might strike next. Emma heard the news when she arrived at the school to find several parents gathered outside, their faces tense with worry. Mrs. Henderson, whose husband ran the general store, was the first to approach her. "Miss Morrison, did you hear about the outlaw? They say he's getting closer to town. Maybe you should dismiss school until the sheriff catches him." Emma considered this carefully. Fear was a powerful thing, and she didn't want to add to the community's anxiety unnecessarily. "I think we should continue with normal routines unless Sheriff Morrison advises otherwise. Children sense our fear, and I'd rather have them here where I can watch over them than scattered around town where they might get into trouble." Her calm confidence reassured the parents, but privately, Emma felt a thrill of excitement that she couldn't entirely suppress. The idea of a notorious outlaw in the vicinity was both frightening and strangely romantic. She found herself wondering what Black Jack Sullivan might look like, what drove him to a life of crime, whether he was truly as dangerous as the wanted posters claimed. These thoughts occupied her mind as she began the morning lesson, and she found herself glancing toward the window more often than usual. When she saw Marcus Thompson riding past the school, her heart gave a little leap that had nothing to do with fear of outlaws. On impulse she called out, "Children, let's practice our penmanship while I step outside for a moment." Marcus had noticed her watching and had reined in his horse near the school's front gate. He touched his hat politely as she approached. "Good morning, Miss Morrison. I hope you're not too concerned about this Sullivan fellow everyone's talking about." Emma felt a flutter of pleasure that he was concerned for her safety. "I'm more curious than frightened, I must admit. It's hard to imagine what would drive a man to such a life." Marcus studied her face carefully. Perhaps desperation. Or maybe he started small and found himself in too deep to turn back. Crime has a way of becoming a trap. Once you're branded an outlaw, it's nearly impossible to become anything else. There was something in his tone that made Emma look at him more closely. "You sound as if you speak from experience." For a moment, Marcus was tempted to tell her everything. The words hovered on his lips. "I am Black Jack Sullivan. I'm the man your brother is hunting, the danger everyone in town fears. And despite all of that, I think I'm falling in love with you." Instead, he said, "I've known men who made bad choices when they were young and spent the rest of their lives paying for them. Sometimes I think our society is too quick to judge and too slow to forgive." Emma felt her heart stir with sympathy. There was a sadness in his voice that spoke of personal knowledge of such judgment. "I believe people can change," she said softly. "I've seen it happen. Sometimes all it takes is someone who believes in them, who sees the good person they could become instead of only the mistakes they've made." Marcus felt something break open inside his chest, a painful combination of hope and despair. Here was a woman who might actually understand, who might see past his reputation to the man he had been before circumstances hardened him. But that same understanding made it even more impossible to tell her the truth, because he couldn't bear to see the light in her eyes die when she learned what he really was. "You have a generous heart, Miss Morrison," he said quietly. "I hope the world never teaches you to be more cynical." Before Emma could respond, one of her students appeared in the doorway. "Miss Morrison? Tommy Henderson is putting ink in Sally's hair again." Emma sighed and smiled apologetically at Marcus. "Duty calls. The glamorous life of a frontier schoolmarm." "Perhaps I'll see you again soon," Marcus said, tipping his hat. "I'd like that," Emma replied, and the honesty in her voice made Marcus's chest tighten with longing. As she returned to her classroom to deal with the ink crisis, Emma found herself thinking about Marcus Thompson's words. There had been something almost confessional in the way he spoke about men who made bad choices, as if he understood such circumstances from personal experience. She wondered what secrets he might be carrying, what pain might lie behind his educated manner and careful politeness. Meanwhile, Marcus rode toward the Silver Dollar Saloon, his mind churning with conflicting emotions. Every minute he spent in Redemption Creek made his situation more complicated. He had originally planned to rob the bank and disappear within a week, but now the thought of leaving Emma behind was almost unbearable. At the saloon he found Pete Hawkins polishing glasses and looking troubled. "Afternoon, Pete. You look like a man with something weighing on his mind." "This Sullivan business has everyone on edge," Pete replied. "Bad for business when folks are afraid to venture out. Sheriff Morrison's been asking questions, trying to figure out where the outlaw might strike next." Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his stomach. "Any ideas?" "Well, if I were a betting man, and I am, I'd say our bank looks mighty tempting to someone in Sullivan's line of work. We're prosperous enough to be worth the risk, but small enough that one man might think he could handle our defenses." It was an accurate assessment, and Marcus couldn't help but admire Pete's logic. "Think the sheriff's ready for trouble? Jake Morrison's no fool and he's got sand when it comes to a fight. But he's only one man, and from what I hear, this Black Jack Sullivan is faster than greased lightning with a gun." Marcus ordered whiskey and settled in to listen as the conversation turned to speculation about Sullivan's next move. It was always useful to hear how the local people thought, what they expected, what they feared. As the afternoon wore on, more men drifted into the saloon, and the talk grew more animated. Marcus learned that Jake had deputized 3 men and positioned them strategically around town. The bank manager, Harold Finch, had hired 2 additional guards and was keeping the vault locked except for absolutely necessary business. Even the stagecoach line had decided to suspend service through Redemption Creek until Sullivan was captured or moved on. By evening, Marcus realized that his original plan was no longer feasible. The town was too well prepared, too alert. A direct assault on the bank would be suicide, and even if he somehow succeeded, the increased vigilance made escape unlikely. But there was another possibility, one that both attracted and repelled him. Instead of robbing Redemption Creek, he could disappear, abandon the Sullivan identity entirely and try to start over as Marcus Thompson, horse trader. The railroad was bringing changes to the frontier, and it might be possible to reinvent himself in one of the growing towns that would spring up along the tracks. The idea of walking away from his outlaw career had never occurred to him before Emma Morrison entered his life. Now it seemed not just possible but necessary. How could he continue robbing and killing when doing so might hurt the woman he was coming to love? As he sat nursing his whiskey and wrestling with these thoughts, Marcus became aware that someone was watching him. Glancing casually around the saloon, he spotted a lean man in a dark suit sitting alone at a corner table. The man's eyes were cold and calculating, and there was something about him that set off every alarm in Marcus's mind. Marcus had survived 12 years as an outlaw by trusting his instincts, and right now those instincts were screaming danger. Without seeming to hurry, he finished his drink and left the saloon, but he could feel the stranger's eyes following him every step of the way. Outside, Marcus considered his options. He could return to his camp and prepare for trouble, or he could try to identify the stranger and determine what threat he might pose. Professional curiosity won out, and Marcus found a position across the street where he could watch the saloon's entrance without being easily spotted. He didn't have to wait long. The lean man emerged from the saloon and walked directly to the sheriff's office. Through the window, Marcus could see him talking animatedly with Jake Morrison, gesturing in the direction of the saloon. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. Somehow his cover had been blown. The question was whether the stranger had definitive proof of his identity or merely suspicions that might be countered. As he watched, Jake Morrison strapped on his gun belt and followed the stranger out of the office. The two men walked purposefully toward Marcus's location, and he realized that within minutes he would be facing the kind of showdown he had hoped to avoid. Marcus slipped deeper into the shadows and made his way quickly toward the livery stable where his horse was kept. If he could reach his mount and get out of town before the alarm was raised, he might still escape without bloodshed. But as he approached the stable, he saw two armed men positioning themselves near the entrance. The trap was closing, and Marcus realized that his time in Redemption Creek was about to come to a violent end. The only question now was how many good people would get hurt before it was over. But first he had to warn Emma. Emma was walking home from the school in the gathering dusk when she heard rapid footsteps behind her. She turned to see Marcus Thompson approaching, but something about his demeanor made her heart skip with alarm. Gone was his usual calm confidence, replaced by an urgency that bordered on desperation. "Emma," he said, catching her arm gently but firmly. "I need to talk to you. Somewhere private." "What's wrong?" she asked, reading the tension in his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that. Please, it's important." Against her better judgment, Emma allowed him to guide her toward the small garden behind the church, where they would be hidden from the street but still within earshot of help if needed. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the cottonwood trees, casting long shadows across the ground. "Emma," Marcus began, then stopped, running a hand through his dark hair. How could he explain without destroying everything between them? "There are things about me that you don't know. Things that complicate everything." Emma felt her pulse quicken. She had sensed mystery in this man from their first meeting, but now she saw something close to fear in his eyes. "What kind of things?" Before Marcus could answer, they heard the sound of multiple footsteps approaching the church. Jake Morrison's voice called out, "Thompson, we know you're here. Come out with your hands visible." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, then looked at Emma with an expression of profound sadness. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I wanted to tell you myself, but it's too late now." "Tell me what?" Emma demanded, but even as she spoke, understanding was beginning to dawn. The mysterious stranger, the educated outlaw who quoted poetry, the timing of his arrival so close to Black Jack Sullivan's crimes, it all suddenly made terrible sense. Jake Morrison appeared around the corner of the church, his gun drawn but held low. Behind him came the lean stranger from the saloon and two deputized townsmen. All had their weapons ready. "Step away from my sister, Sullivan," Jake said quietly. Emma felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "Sullivan?" she whispered, staring at Marcus with wide, disbelieving eyes. Marcus, Black Jack Sullivan, nodded slowly. "I never meant for you to find out this way," he said softly. "I never meant for any of this to happen." "You're Black Jack Sullivan," Emma said, her voice barely audible. "You're the outlaw everyone's been afraid of. You've been lying to me from the moment we met." The pain in her voice cut Marcus deeper than any bullet ever had. "Not about everything," he said desperately. "Not about the way I feel." "Enough," Jake interrupted, raising his gun. "Emma, get behind me. Now." But Emma stood frozen between the two men, her mind reeling with the magnitude of the deception. The educated, gentle horse trader who had quoted poetry and spoken so eloquently about redemption was the same man whose wanted poster promised a $2,000 reward for his capture, dead or alive. The lean stranger stepped forward, and Marcus recognized the cold smile of a professional bounty hunter. "Name's Wade Garrett," the man said. "I've been tracking you for 3 months, Sullivan. Followed your trail from that job you pulled in New Mexico." Marcus kept his hands carefully visible but positioned for a quick draw if necessary. "Garrett, I've heard of you. They say you've never brought a man in alive." "Dead men don't escape from jail," Garrett replied with a shrug. "Much cleaner that way." Jake Morrison's jaw tightened. This is my town, Garrett. If Sullivan surrenders peacefully, he'll get a fair trial. Garrett laughed harshly. A fair trial? For Black Jack Sullivan? Sheriff, this man has killed 6 lawmen and robbed his way across 3 territories. He's got more blood on his hands than a Comanche war party. That's not true, Marcus said quickly, looking at Emma. I've never killed anyone who wasn't trying to kill me first. And most of those weren't lawmen. They were guards hired by the railroads and banks, men paid to shoot first and ask questions later. Emma stared at him, trying to reconcile this revelation with the man she had come to care for. But you have killed people. You've robbed innocent travelers, terrorized communities. Yes, Marcus admitted quietly. I have. And I won't insult you by trying to justify it. But Emma, what I told you about people being able to change, I meant that. I've been thinking about giving up this life, about trying to become the kind of man who could... Who could what? Garrett interrupted with a sneer. Court the sheriff's sister? Start a nice little family? You're a killer, Sullivan, and killers don't get happy endings. Marcus felt his temper flare, and his hand dropped closer to his gun. Maybe not, Garrett. But bounty hunters don't either. The tension in the small garden was thick enough to cut. Jake could see that both men were on the edge of violence, and his primary concern was getting his sister to safety. Emma, please, he said without taking his eyes off Marcus. Get behind the church. This doesn't concern you anymore. But Emma found she couldn't move. Despite the shock and pain of learning Marcus's true identity, she couldn't abandon him to face Garrett's cold-blooded justice. There had been truth in his eyes when he spoke of wanting to change, and she couldn't ignore the gentleness she had seen in him during their conversations. Wait, she said, stepping forward instead of back. Mr. Garrett, you said you were tracking him for 3 months. Has he committed any crimes during that time? Garrett frowned, clearly annoyed by the interruption. What difference does that make? Answer her, Jake said, his sheriff's instincts recognizing the importance of his sister's question. Well, no, Garrett admitted reluctantly. But that doesn't mean. 3 months without robbing anyone, Emma said, looking at Marcus with new understanding. That's not the pattern of a man who can't control his criminal impulses. That's the pattern of a man who's already trying to change. Marcus felt his heart swell with gratitude and amazement. Even now, knowing what he was, Emma was trying to save him from Garrett's merciless justice. The lady's got a point, Jake said slowly. Sullivan, if you've been going straight, why didn't you turn yourself in? Ask for clemency? Marcus laughed bitterly. Sheriff, look at that wanted poster again. It says, dead or alive, and men like Garrett here make sure there's only one option. Besides, what judge is going to show mercy to Black Jack Sullivan? My reputation precedes me, and it's not exactly conducive to forgiveness. But you were planning something here in Redemption Creek, Garrett pressed. Why else would you be scouting the town, asking questions about the bank and the sheriff's defenses? Marcus felt Emma's eyes on him and knew that his next words would determine not just his fate, but any chance of maintaining her respect. I was, he admitted quietly. When I first came here, I was planning to rob the bank. But that was before. He looked at Emma, and she saw in his eyes the same vulnerability she had glimpsed during their evening by the campfire. Before what? She asked softly. Before I met you, Marcus said simply. Before I remembered what it felt like to be seen as something other than a criminal. Before I started believing that maybe I could be worthy of someone like you. Jake Morrison studied the outlaw's face carefully. He had interrogated enough men to recognize truth when he heard it, and despite everything, he believed Sullivan was being honest. More importantly, he could see the way his sister was looking at the man, and it made his heart ache for her. This is touching, Garrett said sarcastically, but it doesn't change the facts. Sullivan's got a price on his head, and I intend to collect it. Over my dead body, Emma said fiercely, surprising everyone including herself. Garrett's eyes narrowed dangerously. That can be arranged, lady. The words were barely out of his mouth before Marcus moved. His gun was in his hand faster than any of them could follow, the barrel aimed directly at Garrett's chest. You just made a very bad mistake, bounty hunter, Marcus said, his voice deadly quiet. Threatening an innocent woman is something I don't tolerate. Ever. Garrett found himself staring down the barrel of Sullivan's Colt and realized he had pushed too hard. The legendary speed was no exaggeration. He had never seen a man draw faster. Jake Morrison was also impressed despite himself. He kept his own gun trained on Marcus but made no move to escalate the situation. Sullivan, don't make this worse than it has to be. Garrett, you're out of line. Apologize to my sister. Like hell I will, Garrett snarled. This whole town's gone soft, protecting a killer like. His words were cut off as Marcus cocked his revolver with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the evening air. Apologize to the lady. Now. Garrett looked into Marcus's eyes and saw his own death waiting there. I apologize for my words, miss, he said through gritted teeth. Marcus held his position for another moment, then slowly lowered his gun. But he didn't holster it. Sheriff, he said to Jake, I want to make you an offer. I'm listening. Let me help you catch the real threat to this town. There's something you don't know about your friend Garrett here. Jake frowned. What are you talking about? Marcus smiled grimly. Tell them about the stagecoach you robbed yesterday while pretending to track me. Emma gasped and Jake's gun swung toward Garrett. Is that true? Garrett's face had gone pale, but he tried to bluff his way through. He's lying. Trying to deflect attention from his own crimes. Am I? Marcus asked calmly. Then explain why you knew exactly which saloon to find me in, and why you were asking so many questions about the bank's security measures. You weren't tracking me, Garrett. You were using my reputation as cover for your own robbery plans. Jake Morrison felt the pieces clicking into place. Garrett had arrived in town claiming to be a bounty hunter, but he had shown far too much interest in the bank and far too little knowledge of Marcus's actual recent movements. Jake, Emma said quietly, when Mr. Garrett was in the saloon earlier, did he ask you about the bank's defenses? Jake nodded slowly. He did. Said he wanted to make sure Sullivan couldn't rob it while he was closing in. But if he was really tracking Sullivan, Emma continued, why would he need to ask about things like that? Wouldn't he be focused on capturing his quarry, not protecting the town's assets? Marcus felt a surge of admiration for Emma's quick thinking. Even in the midst of this crisis, she was working to uncover the truth. Garrett realized his deception was unraveling and made a desperate play. You're all crazy, he shouted, drawing his gun. I'm a legitimate bounty hunter, and Sullivan's a wanted criminal. But Jake Morrison had been a soldier before he became a sheriff, and his reflexes were still sharp. His bullet took Garrett in the shoulder, spinning the man around and sending his weapon flying into the darkness. As Garrett fell to his knees clutching his wounded arm, Marcus holstered his own gun and looked at Jake with respect. Nice shooting, Sheriff. Non-fatal but effective. I don't kill unless I have to, Jake replied. Unlike some people. Marcus nodded, understanding the implied criticism. Sheriff, I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I'd like to make a proposal. Go ahead. Let me help you search Garrett's belongings. If I'm right about him, you'll find evidence of his recent crimes. In exchange. Marcus took a deep breath. In exchange, I'll surrender to your custody. No resistance, no escape attempts. I'll stand trial for my crimes and accept whatever sentence the court decides. Emma felt tears spring to her eyes. Marcus was offering to give up his freedom, possibly his life, to help protect the town and prove his sincerity. Jake considered the proposal carefully. If Sullivan was telling the truth about Garrett, it would solve several mysteries. And the outlaw's willingness to surrender voluntarily was worth something. All right, Jake said finally. But you give me your gun first and Emma goes back to the house. No, Emma said firmly. If Marcus is going to face trial, he deserves to have someone who believes in his capacity for good standing with him. I'm staying. Marcus looked at her with an expression of wonder and gratitude. Emma, you don't understand what you're risking. Association with me could ruin your reputation, destroy your standing in the community. Emma lifted her chin with determination. Then they'll have to judge me too. But I won't abandon someone who's trying to change his life just because it might be inconvenient. Jake Morrison looked at his sister and saw their mother's stubborn courage staring back at him. He knew better than to argue with Emma when she had made up her mind about something important. All right, he said with a sigh. But we do this by the book. Sullivan, your gun. Marcus removed his gun belt and handed it to Jake, the gesture representing a surrender of more than just a weapon. Without his Colt, he was no longer Black Jack Sullivan, the feared outlaw. He was just Marcus, a man hoping for a second chance he might not deserve but desperately wanted to earn. As Jake's deputies took the wounded Garrett into custody and began the search for evidence, Emma moved to stand beside Marcus. She didn't take his hand, that would be improper under the circumstances, but her presence spoke volumes. Why? Marcus asked her quietly. Why are you willing to risk so much for someone like me? Emma looked up at him and he saw not condemnation in her green eyes, but something that looked remarkably like hope. Because I believe what I told you before, she said simply. People can change. And I think you already have, even if you don't realize it yet. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, as if chains that had bound him for years were finally beginning to break. For the first time since he was 16 years old, he dared to believe that redemption might be possible. But first, he had to survive what was coming next. The search of Wade Garrett's belongings proved even more revealing than Marcus had anticipated. In the false bottom of the bounty hunter's saddlebags, Jake Morrison discovered a small fortune in gold coins, jewelry, and banknotes, far more than any honest bounty hunter would be carrying. More damning still was the leather journal they found, written in Garrett's careful handwriting, documenting his crimes over the past several months. The man had been using his supposed hunt for Black Jack Sullivan as cover for a series of robberies across Arizona and New Mexico territories. "Listen to this," Jake said, reading from the journal by lamplight in his office. Marcus sat in the jail cell not because Jake didn't trust him, but because it was the safest place for him until they could sort out the legal complications. Emma sat in a chair beside the sheriff's desk, having refused all suggestions that she go home. March 15th. Robbed the Butterfield stage near Lordspug. Told the driver I was tracking Sullivan and needed information about recent holdups. Made off with $800 and a packet of letters. Driver never suspected. Marcus shook his head in disgust. The man was clever, I'll give him that. By claiming to hunt me, he could ask questions about security, travel routes, anything he needed to know for his next job. April 2nd. Jake continued reading. Hit the bank in Silver City. Posed as a bounty hunter needing to check recent wanted posters. Bank president was so helpful he practically drew me a map of their security arrangements. Emma felt sick. How many innocent people did he hurt while pretending to pursue justice? Too many, Marcus said quietly. And some of those crimes were probably blamed on me or my gang. No wonder my reputation got so dark. Jake looked up from the journal. Speaking of your gang, Sullivan, where are they now? Are they likely to come looking for you? Marcus was quiet for a moment, and Emma could see old pain in his eyes. There is no gang anymore, Sheriff. Not for almost a year now. What happened to them? We were ambushed by a posse outside of Tucson. My brother Danny took a bullet in the chest. He was only 22. Marcus's voice grew heavy with grief. Tom Brennan, who'd been with me since the beginning, died trying to cover our retreat. And Jack Morrison, no relation to you folks, lost his leg when his horse went down. Emma felt tears prick her eyes at the sorrow in his voice. Where are they now? Danny and I got Jack to a doctor in El Paso. Used every cent we had saved to pay for his treatment and set him up with enough money to start over somewhere far from outlaw country. Last I heard, he was working as a bookkeeper for a freight company in California, using a different name. Marcus was quiet for so long that Emma thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Danny died 3 weeks later. The bullet had done too much damage and infection set in. He was delirious at the end, talking about home, about our mother. Marcus stopped and cleared his throat roughly. After I buried him, I just started writing. Didn't much care where I went or what happened to me. Jake studied the outlaw's face and saw genuine grief there. Is that when you stopped robbing? More or less. Oh, I pulled a few jobs after that, but my heart wasn't in it. Made stupid mistakes, took unnecessary risks. Part of me was hoping some lawman or bounty hunter would end it for me. Marcus looked at Emma through the cell bars. Until I came here and remembered what I was living for. Emma wiped away a tear, moved by the tragedy of Marcus's story. How did you and your brother become outlaws in the first place? You're both educated men, surely there were other options. Marcus laughed bitterly. Education doesn't help much when you're 16 years old, orphaned, and the bank is about to foreclose on your family's farm. Danny and I tried to find work, tried to earn enough to save the place, but there just wasn't time. So you robbed a bank, Jake said, not accusingly but with the tone of a man trying to understand. A general store, actually. Our first job netted us $12 and some supplies. Hardly seemed worth risking our necks for, but we were desperate and stupid. Marcus's expression grew distant as he remembered. The store owner was a kind man named Peterson. When he saw how young and scared we were, he didn't even try to fight us. Just handed over the money and wished us luck. Did you hurt him? No, and we never hurt anyone who didn't fight us. That was a rule Danny and I made early on. No unnecessary violence. We were thieves, not killers. Marcus met Jake's eyes steadily. Though I know that distinction probably doesn't mean much to the families of the men who died. Emma leaned forward in her chair. But you said you only killed men who were trying to kill you first. Self-defense isn't murder. Tell that to their widows and children, Marcus replied quietly. Dead is dead no matter what you call it. Jake closed Garrett's journal and set it aside. As a lawman, he should feel nothing but satisfaction at capturing a notorious outlaw. But as a man who had seen his share of war and death, he found himself sympathizing with Marcus Sullivan's story. The frontier was hard on everyone, and sometimes good people made bad choices out of desperation. What happens now? Emma asked, looking between her brother and Marcus. That depends on a lot of things, Jake replied. Technically, I should hold Sullivan until a federal marshal can take him to Phoenix for trial. But given what we've learned tonight... He trailed off, clearly wrestling with a difficult decision. Sheriff, Marcus said, I meant what I said earlier. I'm willing to stand trial and accept whatever sentence the court hands down. But before that happens, I'd like to ask you for one favor. What kind of favor? Marcus looked directly at Emma. Let me help you clean up the mess Garrett made. Some of the crimes attributed to Black Jack Sullivan were actually his work. If I can help identify which ones, it might clear some innocent people who were wrongly accused, or help you return stolen property to its rightful owners. It was a generous offer, and Jake recognized it as such. Most outlaws in Sullivan's position would be focused entirely on their own survival, not on making amends for crimes they didn't commit. That would be helpful, Jake admitted. But it doesn't change the fact that you're still wanted for the crimes you did commit. I understand that. I'm not asking for a pardon, just a chance to set the record straight before whatever happens next. Emma stood up abruptly, unable to listen any longer. This is wrong, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. Marcus has been trying to change his life for months. He could have robbed our bank and been long gone by now, but instead he stayed because he was falling in love with this town, with the idea of belonging somewhere. And now we're going to reward that by sending him to his death. Emma, Jake started to say. No, Jake. Listen to me. You've seen the kind of man he really is. Even tonight, when he could have shot his way out of that confrontation with Garrett, he chose to surrender peacefully. When Garrett threatened me, Marcus risked his own life to protect my honor. Does that sound like the cold-blooded killer described in those wanted posters? Marcus felt his heart breaking as he watched Emma fight for him. She was risking her reputation, her standing in the community, possibly even her relationship with her brother, all for a man who had brought nothing but trouble into her life. Emma, please, he said softly. Don't tear your family apart over me. I'm not worth it. Emma whirled to face him, her green eyes blazing. Don't you dare tell me what you're worth. You're worth someone fighting for you, someone believing in you, someone seeing the good man you can become instead of only the mistakes you've made in the past. Jake Morrison watched his sister's passionate defense of the outlaw and realized that his worst fears were coming true. Emma wasn't just sympathetic to Marcus Sullivan, she was in love with him. And unless he was very much mistaken, the outlaw felt the same way about her. Emma, he said gently, I understand how you feel, but there are legal realities we can't ignore. Sullivan's committed serious crimes and people have died. I can't just let him go, no matter what his intentions are now. Then what's the point of mercy? What's the point of redemption if we never allow anyone the chance to earn it? Before Jake could answer, they were interrupted by a commotion in the street outside. Through the office window they could see torches and hear angry voices. What's that about? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew. Jake grabbed his rifle from the gun rack and headed for the door. Word's gotten out about who you really are. Sounds like some folks want to take justice into their own hands. Emma felt fear clench her stomach. She had heard about frontier lynch mobs, how quickly fear and anger could turn ordinary people into a bloodthirsty crowd. Jake, you can't let them. I won't, Jake said firmly. Whatever Sullivan's done, he's in my custody now and he'll get a fair trial. That's how the law works in my town. Marcus stood up in his cell, his expression grim. Sheriff, maybe it would be better if you just stepped aside. I don't want anyone else getting hurt because of me. Not a chance, Jake replied. You surrendered to me voluntarily, which makes you my responsibility. And I don't break my word to anyone, outlaw or otherwise. Emma felt a surge of pride in her brother, mixed with terror at what might happen next. Through the window she could see at least 20 men gathering in the street, some carrying ropes along with their torches. There's another way, she said suddenly. Both men looked at her. What if Marcus wasn't here when they arrived? Jake frowned. Emma, what are you thinking? The old mining tunnel behind the church. It connects to the schoolhouse cellar. If we could get Marcus there, he'd be safe until the crowd disperses and you can transport him properly to Phoenix. It wasn't a bad plan, Jake had to admit. The tunnel had been dug during the town's brief mining phase and was known only to a few long-time residents. It would be a safe hiding place until tempers cooled. But Marcus was shaking his head. I appreciate the thought, Emma, but I won't skulk around in tunnels like a rat. If these people want justice, let them have it. That's not justice, Emma said fiercely. That's revenge. And there's a difference. The crowd outside was growing larger and more agitated. Jake could hear individual voices now, calling for Sullivan to be brought out and hanged immediately. We don't have much time, he said. Sullivan, I'm going to make you an offer. Help me get through tonight without anyone getting killed, and I'll personally escort you to Phoenix to stand trial. I'll even testify about your cooperation and your willingness to surrender. And if I refuse? Jake looked him in the eye. Then I'll still try to protect you because that's my job. But I can't guarantee that crowd won't get past me. Marcus considered his options. He could try to fight his way out, but that would almost certainly result in innocent people getting hurt. He could surrender to the mob and accept whatever fate awaited him. Or he could trust Jake Morrison and Emma's plan, at least until he could figure out a better solution. All right, he said finally. But I want your word that if anything goes wrong, you'll get Emma to safety first. You have it, Jake replied, already moving to unlock the cell. As they prepared to slip out the back of the jail, Emma caught Marcus's hand. This isn't over, she said softly. Whatever happens, I want you to know that I believe in you. Marcus squeezed her hand gently, memorizing the feel of her fingers against his. And I want you to know that meeting you has been the best thing that ever happened to me, even if it turns out to be the last. Then they were moving through the darkness toward the church, the sounds of the angry crowd echoing behind them as Jake Morrison prepared to face down the mob alone. The old mining tunnel was damp and narrow, carved roughly through solid rock by optimistic prospectors who had never found the silver lode they sought. Emma led the way with a small lantern, its flickering light casting strange shadows on the tunnel walls. Behind her, Marcus moved quietly despite his unfamiliarity with the passage. How much farther? He asked softly. Just around this bend, Emma replied. The tunnel opens into the root cellar beneath the schoolhouse. We should be safe there until Jake can deal with the crowd. As they emerged into the small cellar, Marcus looked around with interest. The space had been converted into storage for school supplies, with shelves lining the walls and neat stacks of books covered by canvas tarps to protect them from moisture. You've made good use of this place, he observed, settling onto a wooden crate that served as a makeshift seat. Emma placed the lantern on a shelf and turned to face him. Now that they were alone and relatively safe, the reality of their situation began to sink in. This man she had come to care for deeply was a wanted outlaw who might be dead within hours if the mob outside had its way. Marcus, she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the thoughts churning in her mind. Go ahead, he said gently. After everything that's happened tonight, I think we're past the point of polite conversation. Emma took a deep breath. I need to understand something. When you told me about your past, about the desperation that drove you and your brother to crime, I believed you. But there's still so much I don't know. How many people have you really killed? How many families have been destroyed by your actions? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. In 12 years as an outlaw, I've killed 6 men. For were guards who drew on me during robberies, they were being paid to shoot outlaws and they knew the risks. One was a bounty hunter who tried to ambush me while I was sleeping. And one. He paused, his jaw tightening. One was a deputy sheriff in New Mexico who tried to arrest my brother. Danny was sick with fever, barely able to sit his horse, and the deputy wouldn't listen to reason. He was going to shoot Danny out of the saddle, so I shot him first. Emma felt tears spring to her eyes. You were protecting your brother. I was, but that doesn't make the deputy any less dead. His name was William Hayes. He was 24 years old, had a wife and a baby daughter. I know because I looked him up later, wanted to understand who I'd killed. Marcus looked up at Emma, his eyes haunted. I sent his widow money anonymously, what I could spare from our jobs. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was all I could do. Oh, Marcus, Emma whispered, moved by his obvious guilt and remorse. As for the families we hurt through robbery, Marcus continued, I honestly don't know the full extent of the damage. We tried to target banks and businesses that could absorb the losses, tried to avoid taking money that belonged to ordinary working people. But that's probably just what I tell myself to sleep at night. The truth is, every dollar we stole came from someone who had worked for it. Emma moved to sit beside him on an adjacent crate. But you sent that deputy's widow money. That shows you understood the consequences of your actions, that you cared about the people who were hurt. Caring doesn't bring back the dead, Marcus said bitterly. And it doesn't undo the fear we caused every time we rode into a town with guns drawn and bandanas over our faces. They sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the distant sounds of the crowd outside. Emma could hear her brother's voice, though she couldn't make out his words. Jake was trying to reason with the mob, but angry men weren't always susceptible to logic. What happens if they get past Jake? Emma asked quietly. Marcus considered lying, trying to spare her the harsh reality, but she deserved honesty. Lynch mobs aren't interested in quick justice. They'll want to make a show of it, probably string me up from the old oak tree in the town square. It won't be pleasant. Emma shuddered. I won't let that happen. Emma, if it comes to that, you need to stay away. Promise me. Don't risk yourself trying to intervene. I can't promise that, Emma said firmly. I won't watch them murder you while I hide in a cellar. Marcus turned to look at her, struck once again by her courage and determination. Why, he asked. Why are you willing to risk so much for someone like me? You could have any man in this territory, educated men, successful men, men who could give you the kind of life you deserve. Why waste your affections on a doomed outlaw? Emma was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. Do you remember what you told me about people making bad choices when they're young and spending the rest of their lives paying for them? Yes. Well, I think sometimes people make good choices too, choices that define who they really are regardless of their circumstances. She reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. Every time I've been with you, I've seen those good choices. The way you helped me gather my scattered papers when we first met. The way you quoted poetry and talked about literature with such passion. The way you protected me from Garrett's threats even though it put you in danger. Marcus felt his heart ache with longing and despair. Those are small things, Emma. They don't balance the scales. Maybe not, she agreed. But they show me who you could become if you had the chance. And I think that person is worth fighting for. Before Marcus could respond, they heard footsteps in the tunnel. Both tensed, ready to run or fight, but then Jake Morrison's voice called out softly. Emma? Sullivan? It's me. They waited as Jake emerged from the tunnel, looking grim but relieved. The crowds dispersed at least for now, he reported. But it wasn't easy. Pete Hawkins and a few other level-headed men helped me convince them to go home, but tempers are still running high. What did you tell them? Emma asked. That Sullivan was being held for transport to Phoenix, where he'd stand trial for his crimes. I also told them about Garrett's journal and how some of the crimes attributed to Sullivan were actually committed by that fake bounty hunter. Marcus looked up with interest. Did that help? Some, Jake admitted. But there are still plenty of folks who think the only good outlaw is a dead outlaw. We need to get you out of Redemption Creek as soon as possible. Emma felt panic rise in her chest. Tonight. First light, Jake said. I've sent a telegram to the federal marshal in Phoenix, explaining the situation. If we can get Sullivan there alive, he'll at least get a fair trial. And what are his chances? Emma asked, dreading the answer. Jake was quiet for a moment. Honestly? Not good. Even if the court takes into account his cooperation and willingness to surrender, he's still committed multiple felonies. Best case scenario, he's looking at 20 years in prison. More likely. He shrugged grimly. Emma felt tears burning her eyes. 20 years might as well be a death sentence. Marcus would be nearly 50 when he got out, assuming he survived that long in prison. And the more likely scenario that Jake couldn't bring himself to voice was execution. There has to be another way, she said desperately. Marcus squeezed her hand gently. Emma, we've known from the beginning that this couldn't have a fairy tale ending. I'm a wanted man, and the law has finally caught up with me. At least this way, I get to face justice instead of a lynch mob. That's not good enough. Emma said, her voice rising despite the need for quiet. You're not the same man who committed those crimes. You've changed, grown, become someone better. Doesn't that count for anything? Jake looked at his sister with sympathy and growing worry. Emma was clearly in love with Marcus Sullivan, and that love was blinding her to the harsh realities of frontier justice. Emma, he said gently, I understand how you feel, but the law doesn't recognize redemption that hasn't been tested by time and proven through actions. Sullivan's cooperation is worth something, but it can't erase 12 years of crime. Then the law is wrong, Emma said fiercely. If we can't allow people to change, to become better than their worst mistakes, then what hope is there for any of us? Marcus felt his heart break watching Emma fight so passionately for him. She's right about one thing, Sheriff, he said quietly. The law does need to allow for redemption. But I also understand why it can't in my case. I've done too much damage, hurt too many people. Maybe it's better this way, maybe I can do more good by facing the consequences than I ever could by running away from them. Emma stared at him in disbelief. How can you just give up? How can you accept this? Because Emma, Marcus said, his voice infinitely gentle, for the first time in 12 years, I've remembered what it means to love someone more than I love myself. And that means wanting what's best for you, even if it destroys me. Before Emma could respond, they heard voices in the tunnel again. This time it wasn't Jake's voice, but multiple men speaking in low, urgent tones. Jake immediately drew his gun and motioned for silence. The three of them waited tensely as the voices grew closer. Sure this is the right way? Someone was saying. Pete said the tunnel connects to the schoolhouse, came another voice. If Sullivan's hiding down here, we'll find him. Emma felt ice-cold fear wash over her. The mob hadn't been satisfied with Jake's assurances. Some of them had remembered the old mining tunnel and were coming to search for Marcus themselves. Jake positioned himself between the tunnel entrance and the others, his gun ready but held low. Sullivan, he whispered, there's another way out through the school. Take Emma and go. I'm not leaving you to face them alone, Marcus replied, moving to stand beside the sheriff. And I'm not leaving either of you, Emma added firmly. The voices were almost at the cellar entrance now. Jake made a quick decision. Emma, blow out that lantern. Sullivan, you know this terrain better than I do. If shooting starts, can you get my sister to safety? With my life, Marcus promised. The lantern went dark, plunging them into absolute blackness. A moment later, torch light flickered in the tunnel entrance, and 5 men emerged into the cellar. Emma recognized them as townspeople. The blacksmith Tom Bradley, shopkeeper Harold Finch, rancher Miguel Santos, and 2 cowboys from the Circle R. Evening, boys, Jake said calmly, his voice coming out of the darkness. You're trespassing on school property. The men spun toward his voice, their torches casting wild shadows on the cellar walls. Sheriff Morrison? Tom Bradley called out. We heard Sullivan might be hiding down here. And if he is? Jake stepped into the torchlight, his badge gleaming on his chest. I told you men that he's in my custody and will stand proper trial. Proper trial, hell? Harold Finch spat. This is Black Jack Sullivan we're talking about. He's killed more men than smallpox, robbed half the territory. What kind of trial is he going to get except a rope and a tree? The kind guaranteed by the Constitution, Jake replied firmly. Even outlaws have rights under the law. Miguel Santos, usually a quiet and thoughtful man, stepped forward. Sheriff, with respect, you didn't lose a brother to Sullivan's gang like I did. My youngest brother Carlos was driving freight for the Santa Fe Company when Sullivan hit his wagon train. Carlos tried to fight them off and took a bullet for his trouble. Died 3 days later. Emma felt Marcus stiffen beside her in the darkness. She could sense his anguish at hearing about another life his actions had destroyed. I'm sorry for your loss, Miguel, Jake said sincerely. But are you sure it was Sullivan's gang? We've learned tonight that many crimes attributed to him were actually committed by others. The witnesses described Black Jack Sullivan himself, Miguel replied. Said he was polite, almost gentlemanly, but shot Carlos without hesitation when the boy reached for his rifle. In the darkness, Marcus closed his eyes in pain. He remembered that job. It had been one of the last ones before Danny was killed. A freight wagon carrying silver from a mine in Colorado, defended by young guards who were brave but inexperienced. Marcus had tried to avoid bloodshed, but one of the guards, a boy who couldn't have been more than 18, had gone for his weapon. Marcus had fired instinctively, the way 12 years of outlaw life had trained him to do. Only later, when they were searching the wagon, had he found the letters in the boy's jacket. Letters from home, from parents who were proud of their son's new job, from a girl who was waiting for him to save enough money to get married. Miguel, Marcus said, stepping out of the shadows. I remember your brother. The men spun toward his voice, raising their torches and weapons. But Marcus kept his hands visible and spoke calmly. Carlos Santos. 18 years old, brown hair, worked for Morrison Freight, no relation to the sheriff here. He was carrying letters from a girl named Maria Gonzalez. Miguel's face went white. How could you know that unless? Unless I was there when he died, Marcus finished quietly. He was a brave kid, Miguel. When my gang surrounded the wagon, he could have surrendered. Instead, he tried to protect the cargo he was being paid to guard. I respect that kind of loyalty. You killed him, Miguel said, his voice shaking with grief and rage. Yes, Marcus admitted. And I've regretted it every day since. Not because he was young, not because he had a sweetheart waiting for him, but because he died protecting something that didn't matter nearly as much as his life did. Emma felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to Marcus take responsibility for yet another life lost to his criminal career. But she also heard something else in his voice. Genuine remorse, the kind of sorrow that came from truly understanding the cost of his actions. "Regret doesn't bring Carlos back," Miguel said, raising his rifle. "No, it doesn't," Marcus agreed. "But Miguel, ask yourself this, will killing me bring him back? Will it make your family's pain any less? Or will it just create more widows and orphans when Sheriff Morrison tries to stop you and good men die for no reason?" Jake stepped between Miguel and Marcus. "He's right, Miguel. This isn't what Carlos would want. Your brother died doing his duty, don't dishonor his memory by abandoning yours." For a tense moment, the outcome hung in the balance. Miguel Santos was a good man driven by grief and a desire for justice. The other men looked to him for leadership, ready to follow his decision whether it led to violence or restraint. Finally, Miguel lowered his rifle. "You're right, Sheriff. Carlos wouldn't want me to become a murderer in his name." He looked at Marcus with eyes full of pain. "But Sullivan, if you have any decency left in you, you'll face your punishment like a man. No more running, no more hiding behind technicalities or sympathetic women." "I give you my word," Marcus replied solemnly. "I'll stand trial for my crimes and accept whatever sentence the court decides. And Miguel, when this is over, if I'm still alive, I'd like to tell you more about your brother. He deserves to be remembered as the hero he was." Miguel nodded curtly, then turned to the other men. "Come on. We've said what we came to say." As the vigilantes filed out through the tunnel, Jake let out a long breath. "That was closer than I like," he admitted. Emma moved to Marcus's side, her hand finding his arm. "That was incredibly brave," she said softly. "You could have stayed hidden, but you chose to face Miguel and take responsibility for what you'd done." "It was the right thing to do," Marcus replied. "Carlos Santos deserved that much from the man who killed him." Jake holstered his gun and relit the lantern. "We can't stay here much longer. Word will spread that you're in town, and next time we might not get off so easily." "What's the plan?" Marcus asked. "I've got a buckboard waiting behind the church. We'll head out before dawn, take the back trails to Phoenix. With luck, we can avoid any more confrontations." Emma felt her heart breaking. In a few hours, Marcus would be gone from her life, probably forever. Even if he somehow survived his trial, he would be in prison for decades. "I'm coming with you," she announced. Both men turned to stare at her. "Emma, absolutely not," Jake said firmly. "It's going to be dangerous enough without." "I'm not asking your permission, Jake," Emma interrupted. "I'm a grown woman and I can make my own decisions. Marcus shouldn't have to face this alone." Marcus shook his head. "Emma, your brother's right. If you're seen traveling with me, it will ruin your reputation permanently. And if we run into trouble on the trail, then we face it together," Emma said stubbornly. "I've made my choice." Jake could see that his sister's mind was made up, and he knew from long experience that arguing with Emma when she had reached a firm decision was like trying to stop a stampede with a stern lecture. "All right," he said with a sigh. "But we do this my way and you follow orders without question." "Understood." Emma nodded, though both men could see the determination in her eyes that suggested she would follow orders only as long as they didn't conflict with her own judgment. As they prepared to leave the cellar and begin the dangerous journey to Phoenix, none of them could foresee the trials that lay ahead, or the unexpected allies they would find along the way. The buckboard rolled through the desert in the pre-dawn darkness, its wheels finding the rough trail by the faint light of a quarter moon. Jake Morrison handled the reins with practiced skill, guiding the two horses around rocks and gullies that could break an axle or lame an animal. Behind him, Emma sat beside Marcus on the wagon bed, both wrapped in blankets against the desert cold. They had been traveling for 3 hours, taking back roads and cattle trails that would keep them away from the main stage routes where they might encounter other travelers. The plan was to reach Phoenix in 2 days, stopping overnight at a way station run by an old friend of Jake's who could be trusted to keep quiet about their unusual cargo. "How much farther to the way station?" Emma asked quietly, not wanting to wake Marcus, who had finally dozed off against her shoulder. The emotional strain of the past day, combined with the knowledge of what awaited him in Phoenix, had left him exhausted. "Another 10 miles or so," Jake replied, glancing back at his sister. "You should try to get some sleep yourself." "I'm not tired," Emma lied. In truth, she was bone-weary, but she didn't want to waste what might be her last hours with Marcus in sleep. Jake studied her face in the moonlight and saw the pain she was trying so hard to hide. His little sister was in love with a man who would probably be executed within weeks, and there was nothing he could do to spare her that heartbreak. "Emma," he said gently, "I know this is hard, but you need to prepare yourself for what's coming. Even if Sullivan gets the most lenient sentence possible, you'll still lose him. And continuing to pin your hopes on a miracle isn't going to make that any easier." Emma was quiet for a moment, her hand resting lightly on Marcus's arm. "Do you remember what Mama used to say about hope being the last thing to die?" "I remember." "Well, I'm not ready to let it die yet. Maybe there won't be a miracle, but maybe there will be. Either way, I'd rather face the future having fought for something I believe in than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been braver." Before Jake could respond, Marcus stirred and opened his eyes. "Sorry," he said, straightening up. "Didn't mean to use you as a pillow." "I didn't mind," Emma said softly, already missing the weight of his head against her shoulder. Marcus looked around, taking in their surroundings. They were traveling through classic high desert country, sparse vegetation, rocky outcroppings, and vast expanses of sand and scrub. In the growing light, he could see mountains in the distance, their peaks touched with the first gold of sunrise. "Beautiful country," he observed. "You sound surprised," Jake said. "I suppose I am. When you're running from the law, you don't often take time to appreciate the scenery. Everything becomes about the next hiding place, the next escape route, the next job to keep you fed and supplied." Emma tried to imagine what that kind of life must have been like. Always looking over your shoulder, never able to trust anyone completely, never able to put down roots or build lasting relationships. It sounded like a special kind of hell. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The excitement, the freedom?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I missed the freedom to ride wherever I wanted without answering to anyone. And there was a kind of excitement in outsmarting posses and staying ahead of the law. But Emma, it wasn't really freedom, it was just a different kind of prison. When you're an outlaw, you're always alone even when you're with other people. You can't trust anyone completely because betrayal means death, and you can't form real attachments because you might have to disappear at any moment." "Is that why you never married?" Emma asked, then blushed at her boldness. Marcus smiled sadly. "Partly. But also because I knew that any woman who got involved with me would be putting herself in danger. Bounty hunters aren't particular about who gets hurt when they're closing in on their target." Jake glanced back at them, understanding now why his sister was so drawn to Marcus Sullivan. Beneath the outlaw reputation was a man who had sacrificed his own chances for love and happiness to protect others from the consequences of his choices. It was a kind of nobility even if it came wrapped in 12 years of crime. They crested a small rise and saw the way station spread out below them. A low adobe building with a barn and corral, positioned near a natural spring that made it a valuable stop for travelers. Smoke was already rising from the chimney, and they could see horses in the corral. "That's Joe Brennan's place," Jake said. "He's good people, used to be a cavalry sergeant before he retired and bought this spread. He'll give us a safe place to rest and resupply." But as they approached the station, Marcus felt his old instincts stirring. Something wasn't right. The horses in the corral were too good, too well cared for to belong to ordinary travelers. And there was something about the way the smoke rose from the chimney, too steady as if the fire had been burning all night. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "I think we should be careful here." Jake was already reaching the same conclusion. As they got closer, he could see that the horses bore military brands, and there were too many of them for a simple overnight stop. "Hold up," Jake said, bringing the buckboard to a halt about 100 yards from the station. "Let me go in first and see what's what." "I don't think that's a good idea," Marcus said. "If there's trouble, you'll be walking into it alone." Before Jake could respond, the door of the way station opened and 5 men stepped out. 4 wore the blue uniforms of the U.S. Cavalry, while the 5th was dressed in the dark suit of a federal marshal. All were armed and alert. "Sheriff Morrison," called the marshal. "I'm Deputy Marshal Thomas Crawford. We received your telegram and rode out to escort the prisoner to Phoenix." Jake felt his heart sink. He had hoped to have more time with Marcus, more opportunity to present his case to sympathetic ears. But the federal authorities had moved faster than expected. "Marshal Crawford," Jake called back. "I appreciate the escort, but we weren't expecting you until Phoenix." "Change of plans," Crawford replied, walking toward the buckboard with the soldiers flanking him. "Territorial governor wants this Sullivan business resolved quickly, before it causes any more unrest. We'll be taking custody of the prisoner now." Emma felt panic rising in her chest. These men looked hard and unsympathetic, nothing like her brother with his sense of fairness and justice. She could see in their faces that they had already decided Marcus's guilt and were simply going through the motions of transporting him for trial. Marcus, meanwhile, was studying the soldiers with professional interest. They moved well, kept proper intervals, and watched all approaches. These were experienced men who wouldn't be easily surprised or outfought. But he also noticed something that gave him hope. "Sergeant," he called to the oldest of the soldiers, "you served in the 7th Cavalry?" The man looked surprised. "How do you know that?" "The way you wear your hat, the position of your rifle." "I rode with some 7th Cavalry boys during the Apache campaigns." "Good soldiers." Jake looked at Marcus with new interest. "You served in the army?" "Scout duty," Marcus replied. "Before I became an outlaw. Worked with the cavalry tracking hostile Apache bands through these mountains." Marshal Crawford had reached the buckboard and was studying Marcus with cold eyes. "Marcus Sullivan, I presume? Also known as Black Jack Sullivan, wanted for multiple counts of robbery, assault, and murder." "That's right," Marcus replied calmly. "Then you'll come with us. Now." Emma started to protest, but Marcus caught her hand and shook his head slightly. "It's all right, Emma. This is what we knew would happen." But Jake Morrison wasn't ready to give up so easily. "Marshal Crawford, I need to speak with you privately before we transfer custody. There are some unusual circumstances surrounding this arrest that you should know about." Crawford looked annoyed. "What kind of circumstances?" "For one thing, Sullivan surrendered voluntarily. For another, we discovered evidence that a significant number of crimes attributed to him were actually committed by a bounty hunter named Wade Garrett, who was using Sullivan's reputation as cover for his own criminal activities." Crawford's expression didn't change. "Interesting but not relevant to the federal charges. Sullivan's wanted for specific crimes with specific evidence. Whatever this Garrett character may have done doesn't change that." "But it might affect sentencing," Jake pressed. "If the court understands that Sullivan has been trying to reform, that he's been cooperative." "Sheriff Morrison," Crawford interrupted, "I appreciate your concern for due process, but my job is to transport prisoners, not to evaluate their character. The court in Phoenix will make those determinations." Emma could see that Marshal Crawford was not a man who would be swayed by appeals to mercy or justice. He was a bureaucrat following orders, nothing more. But the cavalry sergeant was studying Marcus with growing interest. "You said you scouted for the 7th Cavalry. When was this?" 1874 to 1876, Marcus replied. "Worked mostly with Captain Henderson's company, tracking Geronimo's band through the Dragoon Mountains." The sergeant's eyes widened. "Jesus Christ. You're Ghost Walker Sullivan." The other soldiers turned to stare, and even Marshal Crawford looked surprised. "Ghost Walker. That's what the Apache called him," the sergeant explained. "He could track anything through country where most men couldn't find their own shadows. Saved my patrol's bacon more than once when we were hunting hostiles." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "That was a long time ago, Sergeant. I'm not that man anymore." "Hell you aren't," the sergeant said firmly. "A man doesn't change that much. You risked your neck dozens of times to keep soldiers from riding into ambushes. If you've turned outlaw, there's got to be a good reason." Marshal Crawford looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Sergeant Williams, whatever Sullivan may have done in the past doesn't change the current charges against him." But Emma could see that the soldiers were viewing Marcus differently now. Instead of a dangerous criminal, they saw a former comrade who had fallen on hard times. "Marshal," said another of the soldiers, a young corporal, "if Sullivan here is Ghost Walker, then he's the man who saved my brother's life at Canyon de Chelly. Billy Williams, he was with Henderson's company when they got pinned down by Apache riflemen. Sullivan went out alone in the dark and took out the snipers one by one." Marcus remembered the incident, a desperate night action where young soldiers were dying and their officers were paralyzed by indecision. He had acted partly out of professional pride and partly because he couldn't stand to watch good men die for lack of leadership. "Your brother made it home?" Marcus asked. "Yes, sir. Got married last year and started a ranch up in Colorado. Still talks about the scout who saved his patrol." Emma felt her heart swell with pride and hope. Here was proof that Marcus had been a hero before he became an outlaw, that his capacity for good had deep roots that might not be entirely dead. Marshal Crawford, however, was growing impatient. "This is all very touching, but we have our orders. Sullivan, you'll come with us now." "Actually," said Sergeant Williams, "I think we need to discuss this further. If Ghost Walker Sullivan is really trying to go straight, maybe we should be helping him instead of hanging him." Crawford's face darkened. "Sergeant, you're out of line. This man is a federal prisoner, and I'm ordering you to secure him for transport." Williams looked the marshal in the eye. "With respect, sir, my orders come from Colonel Parker, not from you." And I don't think the colonel would want us to ignore new information about a prisoner's background. Emma watched this confrontation with growing hope. The soldiers clearly respected Marcus and were willing to at least consider that there might be more to his story than the wanted posters suggested. Marcus, meanwhile, was thinking rapidly. These men knew him from his army days, when he had been fighting for justice rather than against it. If he could convince them that he was genuinely trying to change his life, they might be willing to help him find a path to redemption that didn't end with a hangman's noose. But first, he would have to prove that Ghost Walker Sullivan and Black Jack Sullivan could somehow become the same person, a man worth saving. The standoff at the way station continued as Sergeant Williams and Marshal Crawford faced each other across the dusty yard. Joe Brennan, the station owner, watched nervously from his doorway, clearly uncomfortable with having federal lawmen arguing in his front yard. "Sergeant," Crawford said, his voice tight with authority, "I'm ordering you to secure the prisoner. Your personal feelings about his past service are irrelevant to current federal charges." Emma felt a flutter of hope. She didn't fully understand the military politics at play, but it was clear that Marcus's past service carried weight with these soldiers. Marcus stepped forward, his hands still visible but his posture straight and military. "Sergeant Williams, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but the marshal is right. I committed crimes after my army service, and I need to face the consequences. Don't jeopardize your career on my account." "Ghost Walker," Williams said, using the Apache name with obvious respect. "What happened? How did a man who saved dozens of lives end up as an outlaw?" Williams didn't back down. "Marshal, with all due respect, I'm not acting on personal feelings. I'm following military protocol regarding the treatment of former scouts who served with distinction. Colonel Parker has standing orders that any man who rode with the 7th Cavalry deserves a fair hearing before he faces federal charges." Marcus was quiet for a moment, weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he decided that if these men were willing to listen, they deserved the full truth. "After my discharge in '76, I went home to Kansas to find my family's farm being foreclosed by the bank. My parents had died of cholera while I was chasing Apache through the desert, and my younger brother Danny was trying to hold things together alone. The bank wanted $800 in back payments, money we didn't have and couldn't earn in time." The soldiers listened intently. These were men who understood family loyalty and the desperate measures men would take to protect those they loved. "Danny and I tried everything legal first," Marcus continued. "Worked odd jobs, tried to get loans, even considered selling the land and starting over somewhere else. But the bank president had his eye on our property for development, and he wasn't interested in payment plans or compromise." "So you robbed him," Crawford said, though his tone was less judgmental than before. "We robbed his bank, yes. Got away with $1,200, enough to save the farm and have a little left over. We thought it would be a one-time thing, a desperate measure to save our family's legacy." Emma could hear the pain in his voice as he relived those early days. "But it wasn't one time." "No," Marcus admitted. "Within a week, we had federal marshals and bounty hunters swarming all over Kansas looking for the Sullivan brothers. We couldn't go home, couldn't contact anyone we knew, couldn't even use our real names. And the bank president had friends in the law. He made sure the charges were exaggerated, made us sound like cold-blooded killers instead of desperate farmers." Sergeant Williams nodded grimly. He had seen how power and money could twist justice, especially on the frontier where influential men often had judges and marshals in their pockets. "So you kept running?" Williams said. "We kept running. And to eat, to buy supplies, to survive, we had to keep robbing. Each job made us more wanted, more dangerous, harder for the law to forgive. Before long, we weren't farm boys who made a desperate mistake. We were professional outlaws with a price on our heads." Jake Morrison, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "Marshal Crawford, you said you had orders from the territorial governor to resolve this quickly. What exactly did he say?" Crawford looked uncomfortable. "The governor is concerned about unrest. There have been rumors that Sullivan might have supporters, people who might try to break him out of jail or interfere with his trial." "And?" Jake pressed. "And his preference is for Sullivan to be shot while attempting to escape. Saves everyone the trouble of a lengthy trial." Emma felt her blood turn cold. "You're talking about murder?" "I'm talking about justice," Crawford replied, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Sullivan's a killer and a thief. The territory would be better off without him." Sergeant Williams looked disgusted. "Marshal, that's not justice, that's an execution without trial. And if you think the 7th Cavalry is going to participate in murdering Ghost Walker Sullivan, you're badly mistaken." The young corporal stepped forward. "Sergeant's right, sir. This man saved my brother and a dozen other soldiers. We don't abandon our own, no matter what they've done since." Marcus felt a strange warmth in his chest. He had forgotten what it felt like to have people stand up for him, to be defended by men who knew his worth as something more than his worst actions. "What are you proposing, Sergeant?" Crawford asked. Williams thought for a moment. "Military tribunal." Sullivan was a scout under military jurisdiction when he served with distinction. If he committed crimes after his discharge, the Army still has an interest in how he's treated. "We take him to Fort McDowell, let Colonel Parker review the case." "That's highly irregular," Crawford protested. "So is railroading a war hero," Williams shot back. Emma could hardly believe what she was hearing. Instead of being dragged to Phoenix for a show trial followed by execution, Marcus might be given a chance to have his case heard by men who understood the complexities of frontier life. But Marcus himself was shaking his head. "Sergeant, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I can't ask the Army to risk its reputation for me. I made my choices after my discharge, and I need to face the consequences like a man." "Ghost Walker," Williams said firmly, "you didn't make those choices in a vacuum. You made them to save your family, to protect your brother, to survive in a system that was stacked against you. That matters." Jake Morrison found himself in the unexpected position of agreeing with the cavalry sergeant. "Marshal Crawford, what's the harm in letting Colonel Parker review the case? If he decides Sullivan should face federal charges, you can still transport him to Phoenix." Crawford was clearly torn between his orders and the growing pressure from the soldiers. Finally, he made a decision that surprised everyone. "All right. But I'm coming with you to Fort McDowell, and if Colonel Parker doesn't want to get involved, Sullivan comes back with me to Phoenix." "Agreed." Williams nodded. "Agreed. But he travels as our guest, not as a prisoner. We owe him that much." As they prepared to change direction and head toward Fort McDowell instead of Phoenix, Emma felt cautious hope blooming in her chest. It wasn't the miracle she had prayed for, but it was a chance. Perhaps the only chance Marcus would get to tell his story to men who might understand the circumstances that had driven him to crime. Marcus, meanwhile, was wrestling with emotions he had thought were dead. For 12 years, he had been alone against the world, trusting no one completely and expecting nothing but betrayal from those in authority. Now suddenly he found himself surrounded by people who were willing to fight for him. Emma with her fierce loyalty, Jake with his commitment to justice, and these soldiers who remembered Ghost Walker Sullivan and were willing to risk their careers to give Black Jack Sullivan a fair hearing. It was terrifying and wonderful at the same time, this feeling of having people who cared what happened to him. And it made him more determined than ever to prove that their faith wasn't misplaced. As the mixed party of civilians and soldiers prepared to ride toward Fort McDowell, none of them could predict what Colonel Parker's decision would be. But for the first time since this whole adventure began, Emma dared to believe that love and justice might triumph over fear and revenge. The desert sun was climbing higher as they set out on yet another uncertain road, but this time they rode not toward certain doom but toward the possibility of redemption. Fort McDowell sat in a valley between red sandstone mesas, its adobe buildings and wooden barracks laid out in the precise military fashion that had characterized army posts throughout the American frontier. As their party approached the main gate, Marcus felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and apprehension. This was familiar territory. He had reported to similar forts dozens of times during his scouting days, but now he was riding in as a prisoner rather than a trusted ally. The sentry at the gate snapped to attention when he recognized Sergeant Williams, but his eyes widened when he got a good look at Marcus. "Sergeant, is that?" "Ghost Walker Sullivan," Williams confirmed. "We need to see the colonel immediately." Word of their arrival spread quickly through the fort. By the time they reached the headquarters building, a small crowd of soldiers had gathered to catch a glimpse of the legendary scout. Marcus could hear whispered conversations, see pointing fingers, and felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing. "Lord Almighty," said an older sergeant with gray in his beard. "I was with Captain Morrison's patrol when the Apache had us pinned down in Devil's Canyon. Sullivan appeared out of nowhere like he was made of smoke, led us right through their lines to safety." Emma felt a surge of pride hearing these testimonies to Marcus's courage and skill. But she also saw the pain in his eyes as he was reminded of the man he had been before desperation and circumstance had led him astray. Colonel Robert Parker emerged from his office, drawn by the commotion. He was a tall, lean man in his 50s with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades on the frontier. His gray eyes swept over the mixed party, civilian sheriff, young woman, federal marshal, and cavalry troopers, before settling on Marcus with unmistakable recognition. "Well, I'll be damned," Parker said quietly. Ghost Walker Sullivan. Marcus straightened to military attention. Colonel Parker, sir. At ease, Sullivan. Or should I say Black Jack Sullivan? The colonel's tone was neutral, neither friendly nor hostile. I answer to both names, sir. Depending on the circumstances. Parker nodded thoughtfully. Sergeant Williams, bring everyone into my office. This conversation deserves privacy. The colonel's office was spartanly furnished but comfortable, with maps of Arizona territory covering the walls and a large desk positioned to catch the light from the single window. Parker gestured for them to be seated, though he remained standing. Marshal Crawford, Parker began, I understand you have federal warrants for Mr. Sullivan's arrest. That's correct, Colonel. Multiple charges of armed robbery, assault, and murder. The territorial governor wants this resolved quickly and quietly. I'll bet he does, Parker said dryly. And you, Sheriff Morrison, what's your interest in this matter? Jake chose his words carefully. Sullivan surrendered voluntarily to my custody, sir. He also helped us uncover evidence that several crimes attributed to him were actually committed by a corrupt bounty hunter. I believe there are mitigating circumstances that deserve consideration. Parker's attention turned to Emma. And you, miss? You seem rather young to be involved in matters of criminal justice. Emma lifted her chin defiantly. I'm Emma Morrison, the sheriff's sister. And I believe that Marcus Sullivan is a good man who made desperate choices under terrible circumstances. He deserves a chance to prove that he can be better than his worst mistakes. The colonel studied her face for a long moment, then smiled slightly. Spoken with the conviction of someone who sees the world in terms of right and wrong rather than legal and illegal. Admirable, if dangerous on the frontier. Finally, Parker's gaze returned to Marcus. What do you have to say for yourself, Sullivan? And I want the truth, not what you think I want to hear. Marcus took a deep breath. Colonel, I won't insult your intelligence by claiming I'm innocent of the charges against me. I've robbed banks and stagecoaches, I've killed men who were trying to kill me, and I've lived outside the law for 12 years. But I've also been trying to find a way back to the man I used to be, the man you knew as Ghost Walker Sullivan. What changed? Parker asked. What made you start questioning the life you'd chosen? Marcus looked at Emma and she saw infinite tenderness in his eyes. I remembered what it felt like to care about someone more than myself. I remembered what it meant to have something worth protecting, worth changing for. Colonel Parker followed Marcus's gaze to Emma and understood immediately. He had seen that look before, the expression of a man who had found something precious enough to risk everything for. Miss Morrison, Parker said gently, would you mind waiting outside while I speak with Mr. Sullivan privately? This conversation may touch on military matters that require discretion. Emma started to protest, but Marcus nodded to her. It's all right, Emma. The colonel and I have history that needs to be discussed. Reluctantly, Emma allowed Jake to escort her from the office, though she positioned herself where she could see through the window. When they were alone, Parker's demeanor shifted subtly. The formal military bearing remained, but there was a warmth in his eyes that spoke of old friendship and mutual respect. Marcus, he said, using the scout's given name for the first time, tell me about Danny. Marcus felt his throat tighten. You heard about that? Word travels fast in military circles. I know your brother died and I know you went off the deep end afterward. What I don't know is why you never came to me for help. Colonel, you had your own career to think about. Getting involved with wanted outlaws wasn't exactly a path to promotion. Parker snorted. Son, I've been stuck at Colonel for 8 years because I have a habit of doing what's right instead of what's convenient. If you had come to me after Danny's death, we might have found a way to get you clear of those federal charges. Marcus stared at him in shock. You would have done that? Marcus, you saved more soldiers' lives than any scout I ever worked with. You showed courage under fire that would have earned you a Medal of Honor if you'd been regular Army. Did you really think I would abandon you when you needed help? The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. For more than a year after Danny's death, he had been consumed by grief and guilt, believing that he was completely alone in the world. To learn that help had been available all along, that his isolation had been largely self-imposed, was almost unbearable. I didn't know, he said quietly. After Danny died, I couldn't think straight. All I could see was that everything I touched turned to poison, that everyone I cared about got hurt. Parker moved around his desk and placed a fatherly hand on Marcus's shoulder. Son, that's grief talking, not truth. You're not responsible for every bad thing that happens to the people you love. Aren't I? Colonel, my criminal career got Danny killed. If I hadn't robbed that bank in Kansas, he'd still be alive, probably married with children by now. And if you hadn't robbed that bank, your family would have lost their farm and ended up destitute in some city slum. You made the best decision you could with the information you had at the time. Marcus looked up at the older man with something approaching wonder. How can you be so understanding about what I became? Parker smiled sadly. Because I've seen what war does to good men, and the frontier isn't much different from war. Sometimes survival requires choices that civilized society would condemn. The question isn't whether you made mistakes, it's whether you learned from them and whether you're willing to do better. And if I am? Then we need to figure out how to get you clear of these federal charges without getting you shot in the process. Hope flared in Marcus's chest, but he forced himself to be realistic. Colonel, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but Crawford has his orders. The territorial governor wants me dead, and he's not going to be satisfied with anything less. The governor's a political appointee who's more concerned with his image than with justice, Parker said dismissively. But he's also up for reappointment next year, which means he needs to keep Washington happy. And Washington, my boy, has been very interested in improving relations with former Confederate states. Marcus frowned, not seeing the connection. The bank you robbed in Kansas, Parker continued. What was the name of the president? Jeremiah Blackwood. Why? Parker's smile turned predatory. Because Jeremiah Blackwood was a Union profiteer during the war, made a fortune selling defective equipment to the army while brave men died because their rifles misfired and their boots fell apart. After the war, he moved west and started buying up distressed properties for pennies on the dollar. I don't understand. What does that have to do with anything? It means, my dear Ghost Walker, that your first victim was a carpetbagger who got rich off the blood of Union soldiers. And if word of that were to reach certain ears in Washington, particularly the ears of congressmen who lost sons to defective Union equipment, it might change how they view your case. Marcus felt his heart racing. You're saying Blackwood was corrupt? I'm saying Blackwood was a war criminal who never faced justice for his crimes. The rifles he sold to Sherman's army had a failure rate of nearly 30%. The boots lasted about a week in campaign conditions. And the medical supplies he provided were so substandard that field surgeons started refusing to use them. Emma, watching through the window, could see that something significant was happening in the office. Both men were leaning forward intently, and Colonel Parker was pulling files from his desk. Here, Parker said, opening a thick folder. I've been collecting evidence against Blackwood and men like him for years. War profiteering may be legal, but what he did crossed the line into treason. Marcus scanned the documents with growing amazement. Bills of sale for defective equipment, testimony from soldiers whose lives had been endangered, correspondence showing that Blackwood knew his products were substandard but shipped them anyway. Why haven't you done anything with this? Marcus asked. Because I'm a colonel in the middle of Apache country with no political connections. But if this information were to reach the right people in the right way, it could destroy Blackwood's reputation and influence. Exactly. And a government that prosecutes war profiteers is less likely to execute the men who robbed them. Marcus sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. Colonel, are you suggesting that we blackmail the federal government? I'm suggesting that we provide them with information that might influence their decision regarding your case. What they choose to do with that information is up to them. It was a dangerous game, but Marcus could see the logic. If the government could be convinced that his first crime was actually an act of rough justice against a corrupt war profiteer, it might cast his entire criminal career in a different light. There's still the matter of the men I killed, Marcus said. Blackwood's corruption doesn't excuse that. No, but it provides context. And context matters in cases like this. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Come in, Parker called. Sergeant Williams entered, his expression troubled. Colonel, we've got a problem. Riders approaching from the south. Looks like a federal marshal with a full escort. And sir, one of the troopers recognized the marshal. It's Harrison Pike. Parker's face darkened. Pike was known throughout the territory as a man who preferred dead outlaws to live prisoners. His arrival meant that the territorial governor was serious about wanting Marcus eliminated rather than tried. How long until they arrive? Parker asked. 20 minutes, maybe 30. Parker turned to Marcus with urgent intensity. Son, we're out of time for subtle political maneuvering. I'm going to ask you to make a choice that could determine not just your fate, but the fate of everyone who's been trying to help you. What kind of choice? I can hide you here at the fort, claim you never arrived and that Crawford was mistaken about your location. But that would make me and my men accessories to harboring a fugitive. Or, Parker's eyes were steady and serious. Or you can trust me to handle this my way. It's risky, and it requires you to have faith that sometimes the system can work for justice instead of against it. Marcus looked toward the window where he could see Emma pacing anxiously in the courtyard. If he chose to hide, he would be putting everyone who had helped him at risk. If he chose to trust Parker's plan, he might be walking to his own execution. But as he watched Emma, he realized that the choice was already made. For 12 years, he had been running from the consequences of his actions. It was time to stop running and start fighting, not with guns and violence, but with truth and the hope that justice might still be possible on the American frontier. "Colonel," he said quietly, "I'm ready to trust you. What do you need me to do?" Parker smiled, and for the first time since this ordeal began, Marcus saw genuine confidence in the older man's eyes. "First," Parker said, "we're going to turn you from Black Jack Sullivan back into Ghost Walker Sullivan, scout for the 7th Cavalry. And then, my boy, we're going to remind the federal government that some debts can never be repaid, but they can damn sure be remembered." The morning sun cast long shadows across the main street of Redemption Creek as Emma Morrison stepped out of the schoolhouse, her day's lessons complete. The town had changed in the months since the dramatic events that had brought Marcus Sullivan into their lives. It was more prosperous now, with new businesses opening and families moving in as word spread about the community's commitment to justice and second chances. Emma walked slowly toward the church, where she often went in the late afternoons to think and pray. As she passed the general store, Mrs. Henderson called out from behind the counter, "Miss Emma, package came for you on today's stage." Emma's heart skipped as she accepted the brown paper parcel. The return address was Fort McDowell, and she recognized Colonel Parker's precise handwriting. With trembling fingers, she opened the package to find a letter and a small wooden box. "Dear Miss Morrison, I hope this letter finds you and your brother in good health. I write to inform you of recent developments regarding Marcus Sullivan that I believe will be of great interest to you. As you know, Mr. Sullivan has spent the past 6 months at Fort McDowell, assisting with various military operations while his legal situation was being resolved. I am pleased to report that his service during this period has been exemplary, and his knowledge of Apache tactics has proven invaluable in our efforts to maintain peace in the territory. More importantly, the investigation into the war profiteering activities of Jeremiah Blackwood has yielded significant results. A congressional committee has been formed to examine cases of fraud and corruption during the recent conflict, and Mr. Blackwood is among those being called to testify. This development has had a profound effect on how certain federal officials view Mr. Sullivan's original crime. Yesterday, I received official word from Washington that all federal charges against Marcus Sullivan have been dropped in recognition of his service to the territorial government and in light of newly discovered evidence regarding the character of his first victim. Mr. Sullivan is officially pardoned and free to resume his life as a civilian. He has asked me to enclose the small item in this package, along with his request that you consider carefully the question it represents. Emma's hands shook as she set the letter aside and opened the wooden box. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, was a simple gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond, clearly the best that an ex-outlaw's limited savings could afford, but chosen with infinite care and love. Under the ring was a note in Marcus's familiar handwriting. "My dearest Emma, I know I have no right to ask this after everything that has happened, but I cannot imagine spending the rest of my life without you. If you can find it in your heart to take a chance on a reformed outlaw who loves you more than life itself, I will spend every day proving worthy of your faith. I have purchased a small ranch north of Tucson, where I hope to raise horses and perhaps start a family. It's honest work, and it's a chance to build something good from the ashes of my old life. But it will mean nothing without you to share it. Colonel Parker has given me permission to return to Redemption Creek to await your answer. I am staying at the Old Way Station, afraid to hope but unable to stop myself from dreaming. All my love, Marcus." Emma clutched the letter to her chest, tears of joy streaming down her face. He was free, truly free, and he wanted to build a new life with her. She looked up to find Jake approaching, having seen her emotional reaction from across the street. "Good news, I take it?" he asked with a knowing smile. Emma showed him the letter and the ring, watching as her brother's expression shifted from concern to understanding to genuine happiness. "Are you going to say yes?" he asked. "Are you going to try to stop me?" Jake laughed and pulled his sister into a warm embrace. "Emma, I've watched you fight for that man when everyone else had given up on him. I've seen the kind of person he becomes when he has something worth living for. If Marcus Sullivan makes you happy, then he has my blessing." Emma hugged her brother tightly, overwhelmed with gratitude for his support and love. Then she stepped back, her eyes bright with determination. "I need to borrow a horse," she said. "Where are you going?" Emma smiled, the radiant expression of a woman whose deepest dreams were about to come true. I'm going to tell a former outlaw that sometimes, against all odds and despite every obstacle, love really can conquer all. As she rode north toward the way station and her future, Emma Morrison carried with her the gold ring that represented not just a proposal of marriage, but a promise that redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to reach for it. Behind her, the town of Redemption Creek basked in the afternoon sunshine, its name finally living up to its meaning. And somewhere in the desert ahead, a man who had once been known as Black Jack Sullivan waited for the answer that would determine whether his story would end in lonely exile or begin anew with hope, love, and the chance to prove that even the most wanted man could become the most worthy. The frontier was changing, becoming more civilized with each passing year. But in the hearts of people like Emma Morrison and Marcus Sullivan, the wild, untamed spirit of the American West lived on, not in lawlessness and violence, but in the courage to love without reservation and the faith that tomorrow could always be better than yesterday. In the distance, thunder rumbled over the mountains, promising the kind of desert storm that would wash the land clean and leave everything fresh and new. It seemed, Emma thought as she urged her horse to a gallop, like the perfect weather for a new beginning.